Welcome to the lecture for Module 5 on constructivism. In this lecture, we're going to define constructivism, look at some of its basic assumptions, describe what norms are, talk about types of constructivists, some criticisms, and offer a concrete example of constructivism in practice. To begin, constructivism says that the world and what we know about it is socially constructed, continually shaped, and subject to change. This means that our identities, our interactions, and our interests are formed through our social relationships. Some of the assumptions that undergird constructivism include that agency and structure are mutually constituted. So individuals or states are the agents, and the structure is the international system in most cases when we're talking about international relations. But unlike some theories that provide a clean separation between those two, it is constructivists who argue that actually you can't really separate one from the other and that they are indissolubly combined and that they are constantly interacting upon one another. Another assumption, using the words of famous constructivist Alexander Wendt, is that anarchy is what states make of it. So instead of thinking of anarchy as this sort of static concept in which it creates a situation that states are going to behave in maybe a very fearful way or a way in which institutions are going to emerge in order to counter the effects of anarchy, constructivists believe that actually anarchy is really just a matter of interpretation and how we choose to behave given that anarchy is happening. Third, international relations is driven by meaning created through these identities, interests, and interactions, or what I call the big three I's. Fourth, constructivists argue that there's a focus on the ideational structure that is important to international relations. Ideational structure is norms, particularly, which we'll talk about next, as opposed to the material structure that scholars like realists and liberals tend to focus more on. So more about norms. Norms are standards of appropriate behavior. They govern what states can and cannot do in the international system. There are different types of norms. There are regulative norms, constitutive norms, and prescriptive norms, each of which play a different role in the international system. And there are different stages at which we see norms throughout the international system based on at the point at which they are present and the degree to which they are able to be enforced. So the first stage is norm emergence, where we see a couple of states maybe adopt a new norm. The next stage is norm acceptance, where a larger number of states will abide by this shared expectation about what appropriate behavior is in the international level. And then there's finally norm internalization, when norms take on a taken for granted like quality, and any time states don't follow them, it is seen as a violation of international norms. Constructivists fall under two different types. One is conventional. Conventional constructivists believe that it is possible to explain the world in terms of cause and effect relationships. So they are more aligned with the positivists in terms of theory, in that they believe we can measure the world in a meaningful way and derive outcomes from our empirical studies. Then, on the other hand, there are critical constructivists who believe that identities are formed through language. We can see examples of this in the way that leaders, for example, speak on an international stage, like at a UN General Assembly meeting, or when they're giving a State of the Union address and how they talk about other countries. So they do not believe that it is as easy or possible to examine the world on an empirical basis and measure things, but rather that the meaning that is permeated through the international system is created by the words we use to describe it. This doesn't mean, however, that constructivism is not without its criticisms. For one, many people have charged that constructivism, especially the concept of norms, which tends to be associated with fuzziness, are simply too difficult to measure. For example, how do we know when a norm begins, and how do we know when that norm has that taken for granted quality? One of the sort of famous examples that is used by constructivists is that we know a norm when it has been violated or countries recognize that it has been violated, but we can't really identify when a norm has begun because it's such at an early stage that it hasn't taken on that quality yet. So measuring norms is difficult, and it poses a challenge to understanding what they are, when they emerge, and how states are bound by them. Another criticism, going back to the initial lecture on theorizing about international relations, is that constructivism might be too complex. It may include too many variables or too many factors to give us a meaningful purchase on how international operates, because if everything is emphasized, then nothing is emphasized. And so that's one of the main criticisms that especially realists will make about the efficacy of constructivism. So a concrete example of constructivism in practice can be seen in nuclear weapons. For example, the United States does not fear Israel, which has nuclear weapons. But the United States has actively tried to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Why is that? Well, the answer, if you're a constructivist, is that the United States considers Israel to be a friend because of its identity, whereas it considers Iran to be an adversary, also because of its identity. So a constructivist would explain the difference in how the United States treats other nuclear powers or powers that are trying to become nuclearized on the basis of the identities of those states and the social relations that they have with the United States.